This is John Duncan, and welcome to the next installment of Drugs in the Brains. Today we're going to talk about marijuana, LSD, and ecstasy and see what they do to the brain. How do they work? What do they do to the brain? You can see in the different categories of psychoactive substances, marijuana is in its own category nowadays. It used to be other things. Hallucinogens are a different category with LSD and ecstasy in there. Let's look at marijuana, see what it does to the brain. First, when a person smokes marijuana, the delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, travels to the brain. It goes through a number of different areas, including the ventral tegmental area, the nucleus accumbens, the prefrontal area where it creates slower thinking, slows that part of the brain down. The parietal lobe, we get slower reactions. Our visual field is slightly affected. We have impaired coordination from its effect on the cerebellum. And of course, the reward pathways institute quite a lot of craving and drug-seeking behavior. The effects on the hippocampus also cause memory impairment. As we look at the neurochemistry of this down on the cellular level, we see the same molecule here, the THC molecule, is passed or has passed through the blood-brain barrier and is in the synaptic area right now. This gradually binds to the THC receptor. That's probably going to be on a GABA neuron. You remember those are inhibitory neurons in the brain. And then that GABA neuron then basically excites by calming the glutamate down, excites the ventral tegmental area into releasing dopamine, which then binds to a receptor on downstream in the mesolimbic dopamine pathway. Once this happens, then we have a cascade of neurological events, chemical events. The G protein binds. Then it leads to the production of cyclic adenosine monophosphate, or CAMP. These go into the genetic structure of the cell in the nucleus and form second messengers, which activate genetic transfers in the cell, which are This is a brain from a young marijuana user. We can see the prefrontal cortical area is decreased. This causes impaired cognition, impulse control issues, poor problem solving, self-control, low self-esteem, problems setting goals. The hippocampus is also impaired, causing impaired short-term memory, loss of context of time and space, impaired speech, and linguistic understanding. The sad part of marijuana use is the fact that it's the most abused drug in the United States, aside from alcohol. What people believe oftentimes is a simple high turns out to cause long-lasting brain damage. Marijuana causes brain damage, despite any of the medical effects that it may have. At what cost? Now that we've seen what marijuana does to the brain, we're going to take a look at other systems, other drugs. This time we're going to look at hallucinogens, LSD and ecstasy, otherwise known as methylene dioxymethamphetamine. LSD and ecstasy are both hallucinogens. This is a molecule of the LSD, lysergic acid diethylamide structure. Typically, it's taken on a blotter. There's a drop of LSD on a piece of paper. Leads to a psychedelic experience, sensory overload experience. Ecstasy does the same, just not as strong of an experience. Has some very similar characteristics. Works off the same systems of the brain. We see with LSD and other hallucinogens that they work by disinhibiting the controlling actions of the thalamus. We have on the left here a normal brain. On the right we have a brain that is active on the influence of LSD. You can see a marked change in the activity of these two brains. The normal brain is able to function, able to process sensation as we normally have it occur. And we see an overall activity on the right side on the LSD brain because the thalamus is now sending sensation like crazy to all parts of the brain. Let's look at this a little more carefully here. Thalamus on each side, causing sensory overload. We'll examine the thalamus and the disinhibiting role that serotonin plays and causes less activity that inhibits the sensation from going wild as it does on LSD. We'll look at that a little more closely here. The thalamus is the central switching station in the brain. It's where all of our sensation comes in together into one point and then is relayed to the appropriate parts of the brain for processing. Then those parts come back to the thalamus and institute motion, behavior, other things, evaluate the behavior with the prefrontal area. So when people are under the influence of LSD, the thalamus is not doing that function. It doesn't coordinate the flow of sensation to the right parts of the brain. It also doesn't filter out extraneous sensation. So the brain has sensory overload. We experience that sensory overload in the form of hallucination, delusions, the confusion between perception, imagination, memory, all of the different phenomena associated with the abuse of LSD and the loss of mental control and mental validity. So in the way of a recap here, we see that the thalamus in the center of the brain coordinates all the sensation flowing to different parts of the brain, and when the thalamus malfunctions, it causes the overexcitation of the brain. The thalamus is rich in serotonin neurons. Their function is to keep it from processing too much information at one time. Normally, we see the neurons released in the brain in response to electrical impulses. This results in the normal activation of serotonin receptors, which keeps our psychological and physiological function on an even keel. It tunes, in this case, the thalamus. Serotonin is released, binds to a receptor molecule. Once it has an effect, it's released from that and goes up to the reuptake mechanism for recycling. This reuptake mechanism is blocked by SSRIs, which elevates the mood just a little bit. During LSD or ecstasy abuse, we'll see a sustained increase in the amount of serotonin, leading to more activation. And this can produce euphoria, but it also slows down the GABA neurons and floods the brain with glutamate. That overexcitation makes the different areas of the cortical structure, the other parts of the brain, overload with sensory information. And here we have an example of what that would look like. We've seen the brain on the left, being the normal brain, the one on the right being the brain that's under a sensory flooding from LSD. And then finally, what we see is after the effects of these drugs, LSD and ecstasy, we have a overall downgrading of the serotonin activity in that part of the brain. Matter of fact, what occurs is that the serotonin is less active, making it a little bit more of a difficulty to perceive sensations, to sort them out. This usually results in a kind of a depression that persists for quite some time. And here we see the less serotonin in the synaptic cleft, less serotonin activity, and this may happen for months. This can cause serious depression, low motivation. Ultimately, the brain chemistry changes, serotonin's reduced, the metabolites for serotonin are reduced, the brain structure changes by changing the transporters, and even serotonin nerves degenerate and die.